YouTube is filled with videos dealing with the legend of the lost city of Atlantis. And why not? I mean, come on. Atlantis, right? It's a subject that has fascinated people for more than 2,000 years. One video in particular that has gotten attention here on YouTube recently is that of Jimmy Bright from the Bright Insight channel. In it, Bright relates the theory that the Richat Structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, in the Adrar region of Mauretania, is the most likely location for the site of Atlantis. One of my friends forwarded me the video to check out. She knew I was a historian of antiquity and that I was particularly interested in these kinds of topics. So I watched, and now I want to offer my thoughts on the theory propounded on Bright Insight. No offense to Bright, whom I know is a fellow enthusiast of ancient history, and I certainly want to encourage interest in this topic. But, unfortunately, there are weaknesses in the arguments made, and even several errors of fact that injure the theory beyond repair. So, is Atlantis to be found in Mauretania? Bright actually has made 3 videos on the subject, and to be thorough, I will address what is said in all of them. They are the Lost City of Atlantis, Hidden in Plain Sight, the Lost City of Atlantis, Hidden in Plain Sight Part 2, and Ancient Map shows the Lost City of Atlantis is the Eye of the Sahara. I'm letting you know about them, and I'll provide links so that you can check to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything that Bright says. He's not the originator of most of the arguments he presents. He properly attributes most of them to a documentary made back in 2011 by George S. Alexander and Natalis Rosen called Visiting Atlantis, which is on the Gaia website. I went back to that video to see if Bright changed anything, and to get the full arguments behind the theory that the Eye of the Sahara is Atlantis. The video is behind a paywall, so you can't watch it without subscribing to the website, so I will address its arguments for you here. To be fair to Jimmy Bright, I would like to show you what he says at the end of his 3rd video on the subject so that you understand where he's coming from.
Let me just say that I have not discovered anything. I only discovered a little-known documentary on the topic of Atlantis, and I am simply sharing that information with as many people as I possibly can. And that is the purpose of this channel. I have no desire to have something published in some scientific journal. That's for other nerds. I'm a different type of nerd. And nerd is a term of endearment, by the way, for me. My desire is to share information that I find interesting or important with the masses, and I will be discussing many different topics on this channel. And in the future, I will even be remaking certain videos I have now that already have millions of views, as I'm trying to build the quality of this channel, and some of those videos, just the presentation, various inaccuracies in the information, the editing, there's just a lot of room for improvement, so look forward to that. And keep in mind, I do 100% of this myself, and I'm learning as I go.
Taking him at his word, we will go forward under the assumption that he's presenting this theory merely as a matter of interest and curiosity, and that he's open-minded and not dogmatic about any of it. To keep this video from getting too long, I will be splitting it into 2 parts. In part 1, I will be focusing most of my attention on the writings of Plato on the subject of Atlantis, which Bright relies on heavily. Although my study of ancient history includes examination of a significant amount of archaeological findings, it can't help but do so. As a trained historian and not a professional archaeologist, most of my work deals with ancient documents. And so, I feel comfortable talking about the historical writings referenced by Bright Insight, the most notable of which is Plato, our main source of information on Atlantis. Plato, as you may know, was a Greek philosopher who lived in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE. We have quite a few of his philosophical dialogues. His writings on Atlantis come from 2 of his later dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. The Timaeus is concerned with the proper running of a state. One of its characters lays out a cosmological myth. It talks about the creation of the world by a demiurge, which is a kind of craftsman god, and an analysis of what the Greeks believed were the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. The Critias is an unfinished sequel to the Timaeus. These works, which are about 2,400 years old, are the oldest sources we have on Atlantis. There is nothing older, but Bright and his source, Alexander, claim that the information about Atlantis is older than Plato.
Many people are not even aware that the information contained in Plato's writings of Atlantis actually originate from the ancient Egyptians.
The Egyptians? How does he arrive at this conclusion?
Plato received all the information about Atlantis from Solon, who was his ancestral relative separated by 6 generations.
Solon was an Athenian aristocrat and statesman who lived about 2 centuries before Plato. Today we possess some fragments of Solon's poetry, but none of these mention Atlantis. So we can't verify the statement made in Plato. Now you may say, even if Solon did tell the story of Atlantis, that's still only 200 years before Plato, so it doesn't really get us that much further back in history. But then they make the case that Solon, in turn, got his information from a yet earlier source.
In Solon's later years, he traveled to Egypt in the search of knowledge, and Egypt at that time had the longest documented historical records available. And he visited Neph's temple at Sais, where he learned of the history of Atlantis from a high Egyptian priest who translated the hieroglyphs that were carved into stone within the temple, which also described that Egypt was once a colony of the Empire of Atlantis.
This temple of Neith at Sais no longer exists, so we can't go to Egypt to corroborate this tale. According to Plato's writings, there are several claims this priest from Egypt is said to have made. 1. That the goddess Athena founded Athens 9,000 years ago, and Sais in Egypt 8,000 years ago, both before several great deluges that destroyed the earth. Yeah, the Greeks believed in more than one great flood. 2. Athens at that time was the best governed of all cities in the world, and was the leader of Greece. And for that reason, Athena gave many of its customs and laws to the Egyptians. 3. At that time, an island larger than the continents of Africa and Asia combined existed outside the straits of Gibraltar called Atlantis. It was founded by the god Poseidon. 4. The first king of Atlantis was Atlas, the son of Poseidon. 5. Atlantis had an empire that controlled North Africa as far as Egypt and southern Europe as far as Italy. 6. Atlantis went to war with Athens and Egypt, but Athens defeated Atlantis, and it's been 9,000 years at the time of Plato's writing since this war. Number 7. Then in a single day, due to violent earthquakes and floods, the army of Athens sank into the earth, and Atlantis sunk into the sea. Number 8. Only a shoal of mud exists where the island of Atlantis used to be, making that part of the sea impassable by ships. The Critias has a full description of the layout of the city of Atlantis. None of this appears in the Timaeus. Both Bright and Alexander say that Solon made detailed notes of what he learned in Egypt. Alexander going so far as to say, Solon's detailed notes about the existence of this great empire were published 6 generations later by his descendant Plato, the great philosopher. His implication is that Solon gave his detailed notes to Plato. In other words, he's trying to give the impression that Plato was reproducing almost the exact wording of the hieroglyphs in the Temple of Neith. 2 sleights of hand they play here. First, nowhere in Plato's writing does it say that Solon took notes of what was in the temple, much less detailed notes. It does say he took a few notes down from the Egyptians and then began to work on a poem based on the tale that the priest told him. The reason Bright and Alexander say detailed notes, I guess, is because the description of Atlantis is so detailed in the Critias that they assume this description comes directly from Solon's writings. And yet, the character Critias, the one who is telling the Atlantis tale in this dialogue, is speaking off the cuff. He is not, in Plato's story, looking at any writings while he's speaking. He is going from memory. Moreover, Bright and Alexander emphasize that Plato was a descendant of Solon, and I guess are suggesting that since he was a relative, that means the notes must have been passed down from generation to generation. But according to the story, it is Critias, not Plato, who got the information from Solon. Note what Critias says. If Solon had only, like other poets, made poetry the business of his life, and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, and had not been compelled, by reason of the factions and troubles which he found stirring in his own country when he came home, to attend to other matters, in my opinion, he would have been as famous as Homer or Hesiod or any poet. So here Critias says that Solon was writing a poem about his experiences in Egypt, which he never finished. The suggestion also is that the purpose of the writing was not to present historical or scientific information, but to entertain. Critias explains why the characters in the Atlantis story have Greek names. I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason of this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names, and found that the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language. And he recovered the meaning of the several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather Dropidas had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. So according to Critias, Solon copied down the pertinent names for his poem, but that's all he's said to have written down. Then he went home and started composing his poem. Critias's great-grandfather, Dropidas, who was a friend of Solon, had the unfinished poem, which he passed on to Critias. Please take note that Critias says that he studied the writing carefully when he was a child, which would have been many years ago. He does not say he studied it since, so whatever he's telling Socrates here is from memories formed long ago. There is nothing here about the information being passed to Plato. Keep in mind here that if this conversation between Critias and Socrates actually happened, then it would have happened many decades, at least 4, before Plato wrote it down. So he would have been remembering something Critias said about something Critias remembered studying as a child. Now that is of course assuming that the conversation actually happened, but it is well known that Plato, especially in his later dialogues, simply made these conversations up. He invented them for the purpose of presenting his philosophical views. Here's what Bright says about that.
According to the experts, Atlantis is just a fictional story that Plato made up to encourage better behavior among governments and its citizens. And modern academics are saying that the story of Atlantis must be false. Yet Plato and Solon were known for their brilliance of mind and strength of character. And this is the only example, at least that I'm aware of, where they were ever accused of lying about something. And the Egyptian description of Atlantis at the Temple of Neith in Sais, Egypt, no longer exists today, although perhaps those stones could be found underneath the Nile River somewhere, but it did exist for several hundred years, possibly a millennia. And I'm having difficulty finding an exact date on the temple's destruction by the Nile River, but it was long after Solon and Plato had died. So why would Solon and Plato lie about something that could be verified back then, as it was common for people to travel to Egypt, and the temple still existed at that time?
Let me ask you something. If you go to the movies, let's say you're watching a Marvel movie, do you think to yourself as you're watching the movie, hey, is the writer lying to me? Did this really happen? Of course not, because you know it's just a movie. Well, it's the same thing here. No one would have gone to verify Plato's words in Egypt, because they knew when they read the Timaeus and the Critias, they were reading fictional dialogues. Verification wouldn't even be on their minds. This is a major mistake that Alexander and Bright make, taking every word of these dialogues as the direct testimony of Plato to his audience, as if it were some kind of textbook. These are not Plato's lectures, nor Plato's historical works. They are Plato's dramas, in which characters in imaginative discussions spur readers to philosophical activity. Plato himself never speaks or even appears in any of his dialogues. Instead, Socrates does. But even though Socrates was a real person, it's unlikely that he engaged, historically speaking, in these actual conversations. Am I being too dismissive? I mean, couldn't these dialogues be transcripts of actual conversations that happened in real life? It seems highly improbable that Plato, as a youth, would have taken down a transcript of Socrates' conversations in some kind of shorthand, planning to write them into a book decades later. The idea of making transcripts of conversations is a modern concept anyway. Moreover, looking at Plato's dialogues as a whole, it would be amazing if Socrates had so many conversations with so many famous historical figures. It's more reasonable to conclude that the dialogues were a vehicle through which Plato could propound his own philosophical views, rather than simply a way for him to repeat things that Socrates taught. So that's how we know it's fiction. But that doesn't mean that each and every character is propounding Plato's views. Socrates quite often does propound Plato's views, although not all of the time, because he's a character too. The other characters, who sometimes are based on real people and sometimes completely invented, represent types, often authority figures, examples of those who might hold different lines of thought. Thoughts opposed to Plato or different from Plato. Okay, then, well, if Socrates is propounding Plato's views in the conversations, then we can say that Plato is speaking to us directly through Socrates, right? Usually. Though it's not a hard and fast rule, because Socrates often comes to the correct conclusion by the end, but at the beginning, he might not yet be there. But Socrates is not the character who gives the testimony about Atlantis. Another character, Critias, does. Who is Critias? It's possible that Plato's Critias character is modeled on the famous Critias, who was one of the 30 tyrants of Athens, a pro-Spartan oligarchy that came to power after the Peloponnesian War. But he's not explicitly identified as this Critias in Plato's works, and the age of the character doesn't really match up with the time. All we know from Plato's writing is that the character Critias says that his great-grandfather Dropidas was a friend of Solon. Was there a real Critias whose great-grandfather was Solon's friend? Maybe. But maybe not. Historical accuracy was not a priority in Plato's dialogues. All conversations in these works were constructed to facilitate the presentation of Plato's theories. Literary interpretation can go very wrong when one misunderstands the work's genre. Now, yeah, a writer from about 700 years later, Diogenes Laertius, claims that this Critias, in the book, was in real life Plato's great-uncle. Also that Solon's brother was Plato's ancestor. But Plato never says this. And scholars treat Diogenes' work with caution because Diogenes wrote so much later, and never cites any sources. And even if Critias in real life was related to Plato, these dialogues are still not real life. So when anyone treats the words of the character Critias as historically factual, we rightly react with a healthy amount of skepticism. But you may ask, why would Plato make up the story of Atlantis and put it into Critias' mouth, especially in such detail? The answer is that Plato was using the myth of these ancient empires to make a point about the arrogance of empires in general, which could be related to political matters in his own time. The Timaeus opens with Socrates explicitly pegging the conversation as being about the state and the proper way of running it. It's evident from the corpus of Plato's works that Plato was both a myth teller and a myth maker. He often uses myth as a way of hooking his less philosophical readers so that they will be more interested in what he has to say. All over Plato's dialogues you'll find myths, whether that be traditional myths, which he sometimes modifies, or myths that he invents. The myths Plato uses are narratives that depict particular beings, deeds, places, or events that are purposely beyond the reader's experiences so that they cannot be rationally examined or empirically verified, even if his readers wanted to. So it fits in with what Plato always does. Despite the fact that Plato wouldn't want a reader to try to rationally verify his myths, that doesn't stop some today from trying it.
So one of the first things to point out is the supposed date of Atlantis' destruction according to what Solon had learned while visiting Egypt, which was that the event that destroyed the lost city had occurred 9,000 years earlier, which is a very interesting time frame, considering that Solon visited Egypt 2,600 years ago. And 9,000 years plus 2,600 years equates to 11,600 years before present time today, which just so happens to coincide with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, which of course I've discussed in many other videos. Long story short, to anyone that's not familiar or new to the channel, there was a massive change in global temperatures, sea levels fluctuated, a massive extinction event of 75% of mammals in North America occurred. There's even evidence of global fires said to have been larger than the ones that occurred during the extinction event that killed off the dinosaurs, scorching at least 10% of the Earth's land surface. The evidence for this event is scientifically overwhelming and is likely related to a fragmented comet. And the point is that it's very likely that this event is related in some way to the destruction of Atlantis.
Taking the character Critias' words as possibly factual, Bright suggests that Atlantis may really have existed 9,000 years before Plato's time, so about 11,500 years before our present time. Even if we were to assume that Critias' tale is true, that Critias was a real person who had a granddad that knew Solon, and that Solon visited Egypt and got information about Atlantis from an Egyptian priest who wasn't lying about the hieroglyphics in the Temple of Neat. The earliest the writing in that temple could have existed was when Egypt had a full writing system. Our earliest example of a full sentence of Egyptian writing is from the reign of Set-Peribsen, around 2800 BCE. That's over 6,000 years after Bright says Atlantis was destroyed. 6,000 years! How can one explain how the information was preserved through all that time? Through a time without writing? Are we to believe that the detailed description we have of Atlantis in the Critias was preserved intact by humans orally through thousands of years of the Stone Age? That is a big frog to swallow. And Bright, in one of his other videos anyway, seems to realize this.
And the telephone game is a great analogy that shows how easily and quickly indirect communication can be corrupted, and it cannot be overstated how significant this is in regards to what we know about history, and how it's virtually impossible for truth to not be lost through time and translation.
Now I know what Bright would say. He would say, well, some truth can be transmitted over that time. I mean, it might not be fully accurate, but the kernel of truth might still be there somewhere. Well, yeah, it could be, but the question is, what is your evidence for it? We don't have any evidence for the existence of the Atlantis myth prior to Plato, 2,400 years ago. And you're arguing that it existed long before then without evidence. It's just imagination. It's just saying, well, wouldn't it be cool? Well, yeah, it would be cool, but wishing it to be so doesn't make it true. Here we have a situation where the belief in the existence of the myth is preceding the evidence for it. The right way to do it is to base your belief on the existing evidence. Bright, notably, avoids mentioning that Critias also says that Athens existed 9,000 years before Plato's time. But this cannot be neatly ignored, since Critias' main point is that Athens and Atlantis were at war with one another 9,000 years previously. Do we have any evidence from archaeology of when Athens was founded? We do. Excavations on the Acropolis, the first part of the city to be inhabited, show that settlement goes back to Greek Neolithic times, about 3,500 to 3,200 BCE. That's 6,000 years too late for Critias' tale to be true. If we can't trust what he says about the age of Athens, we can't trust what he says about the age of Atlantis, since he ties the history of the two together. No one mentions that a description of 9,000-year-old Athens is provided by Critias in just as much detail as the description of Atlantis. And this description of Athens contains all sorts of fantasies that contradict archaeological evidence of the site. Now, the argument that Bright, based on Alexander, uses to suggest that the Richat structure was the site of Atlantis is not what you might think is the obvious one, that the remains of a magnificent ancient city have been found there. Alas, no. The site is completely empty of ruins. Instead, their argument relies on matching the characteristics of the site with the description written in the Critias.
Because in this video, I'm going to use the exact words that Plato used to describe Atlantis, its location, and the geographical land features that surround it.
In order to make the case as strong as possible, Bright chooses only the parts of the description of Atlantis in the Critias that would best make the case, and he leaves out the rest. The parts he uses are as follows. That the diameter of the structure matches the diameter that's given by Critias. That Critias says that Atlantis was on a level plain, and the Richat structure is on a level plain. That Critias says that there are mountains to the north of Atlantis, and there are mountains to the north of the Richat structure. And that the colored rocks near the Richat structure match the colored rocks given in Critias's description. Kinda. That Critias says there was a freshwater spring at the center of Atlantis, and there appears to be a well there now. Not an ancient one, of course. That Critias says there were elephants near Atlantis, and that there are elephants within the vicinity of the Richat structure. And that Critias says there was copper and gold in Atlantis, and there is copper and gold and iron in Mauretania. As you probably can see, most of these, actually all of them except for the first, are quite general and could fit the description of probably hundreds of sites. They're simply not specific enough. But the first one I want to comment on, because it is specific and appears to match. At first thought, this piece of evidence seems impressive. Wow, the size of the site today is exactly the same as in Plato's Critias. But the number is fudged. First of all, this is not an exact fit, it's an approximate fit. It's ballpark. Critias says that Atlantis was 127 stadia in diameter. That's the Greek measurement. Well, how long is a stadion? Well, that's tricky. The ancient Greeks did not have a precise length for it. A stadion was an approximate measurement, ranging from about 607 to about 630 feet, or 185 to 192 meters. So Alexander chose a length for a stadion that would most closely match the size of the Richat structure, so then it could look like an almost perfect match. Second, the site's diameter doesn't measure 23 kilometers. It measures 38 kilometers. In order to make the measurement fit, Alexander had to eliminate the outer trench and the ridge beyond that. So he's basically taking out the parts of the Richat structure that prove inconvenient. More significantly, the parts of Plato that do not match the structure are conveniently ignored, namely that the island of Atlantis was larger than Africa and Asia combined. It was opposite the Pillars of Heracles, that's the Straits of Gibraltar. It now was a barrier of mud through which Greek ships could no longer get from Greece to the ocean. There was an abundance of wood in the area, including fruit trees and chestnuts. A canal was dug from the outer circle to the inner one. The outer land zone had a width of 3 stadia, and so did the next land zone inside of it. The next 2 land zones inside each had a width of 2 stadia, and the next land zone inside of that had a width of 1 stadion. The center island had a diameter of 5 stadia. A wall 50 stadia distant from the outermost land zone was built around the city, which means the city limits would have extended well beyond the outer trench of the Richat structure. And mountains completely surrounded the plain on which the city sat. And the plain was 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 stadia in width. None of these descriptions, none of them, match up with the Richat structure. On his FAQ page on his website, George Alexander answers the objection about the measurements not matching up by saying this: The information which we have about those inner dimensions is from the Egyptian colony, from a country dominated by the Atlantean military forces. Any superpower, today or then, will keep information about military capabilities, size, and strength confidential or misleading. One could almost expect that. So any description that doesn't match, we can just dismiss as deliberate Atlantean misinformation. But any description that matches, we can be impressed by and marvel at. Alexander's making it basically unfalsifiable. In part 2 of this discussion, I'll be looking at some objections to this Atlantis theory that Bright responds to. I think you'll find it interesting. If you want to be sure not to miss it, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.